Accelerated learning, binaural beats. Listen to these fire code guidelines to review for the California Supplemental exam. Ensure you consult the most up-to-date version of the California Code of Regulations, Title 24, Part 9, the California Fire Code, Chapter 49, and Title 24, Part 2, which is the California Building Code, Chapter 7A. The intent of this recording is to review important concepts related to wildland-urban interface fire areas and guidelines to protect life and property from fire hazards. Play the audio before you sleep or when you wake up in a relaxed state. Repeat the code guideline and use your imagination to apply it to what you already know. Let this learning tool guide you, knowing you will succeed. Let's begin. California Fire Code. Requirements for wildland-urban interface fire areas. This is taken from the California Code of Regulations, Title 24, Part 9, Chapter 49. The intent is to reduce the loss of life and property from wildfires. This chapter contains requirements for development and construction in local responsibility areas, or LRAs. These LRAs are designated as Very High Fire Hazard Severity Zones and for areas that are designated by the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection as State Responsibility Areas, or SRA. Let's repeat. This chapter covers areas that are local responsibility areas, or LRAs, that are designated as Very High Fire Hazard Severity Zones, and areas designated by the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection as State Responsibility Areas. Next, the code provisions are repeated in Title 14 and Title 19 of the California Code of Regulations. What mitigation strategies are included to reduce the hazards of fire originating within a structure and spreading to a wildland, and fire originating in a wildland and spreading to a structure? The mitigation strategies are as follows. Number 1, development of fire protection plans. Number 2, development of landscape plans and long-term vegetation management. Number 3, creation and maintenance of defensible space. Define a wildland-urban interface area. A wildland-urban interface area, or a WUI, is a geographical area identified by the state as a fire hazard severity zone, or other areas designated by the enforcing agency to be at significant risk from wildfires. Define a local responsibility area, LRA, versus a state responsibility area, SRA. LRAs, or local responsibility areas, are under the financial responsibility of preventing and suppressing fires of city, county, or district areas. State responsibility areas are under the financial responsibility of preventing and suppressing fires by the state. These areas are classified by the Board of Forestry. Describe requirements of a fire protection plan. The requirements of a fire protection plan include: if a fire code official requests a fire protection plan, then it must be prepared by a licensed design professional, a landscape architect, or a qualified specialist. A plan is based on a wildfire hazard assessment, which includes location, topography, climate, and fire history. And A plan must address access, egress, road and address signage, water supply, fuel reduction, and defensible space requirements. What is included in a final fire protection plan? A final fire protection plan includes a map of all plants and its locations, identify irrigated versus non-irrigated zones, requirements for vegetation reduction around emergency access and evacuation routes, identify points of access to maintain vegetation in common areas, statements from the community that they will maintain fuel modification zones, and further, these statements must be included in covenants and restrictions for property owners to maintain vegetation. The next section intends to outline fire hazard severity zones, which are classified by the State Fire Marshal. When recommendations are received, the local agency must make the information available for public review. The local agency can designate areas in addition to the State Fire Marshal as a fire hazard severity zone. The next section intends to prescribe methods of materials and construction for exterior wildlife exposure protection. This section says to refer to the California Building Code, Chapter 7A, and the California Residential Code, R337, and the California Referenced Standards Codes, 12-7A. For state responsibility areas, construction methods for wildland urban interface areas are designated in the California Public Resources Code. In very high fire severity zones, local responsibility areas, construction methods for wildland urban interfaces are designated in the California Government Code. The next section intends to reduce non-fire resistant vegetation close to a structure. The guideline says, if landscape plans are required by the enforcing agency, what should it include? Number 1, a landscape plan should include delineate 30 feet and 100 feet fuel management zones from all structures. Number 2, identify existing vegetation to remain and proposed new vegetation. Number 3, identify irrigated areas. Number 4, include a plant legend. Number 5, identify ground coverings within the 30-foot zone. This section requires that all new vegetation be fire-resistant vegetation. What are the requirements for all new plantings of shrubs? Number 1, shrubs should not exceed 6 feet in height. Number 2, the aggregate diameter of a group of shrubs should not exceed 10 foot in diameter. Number 3, shrub groupings separated from other groups should be a minimum of 15 feet. Number 4, shrub groups separated from structures by a minimum of 30 feet. And number 5, where shrubs are below or within a tree drip line, the lowest tree branch must be a minimum of 3 times the height of the understory of the shrubs, or 10 feet, whichever is greater. What are the requirements for trees within the 30-foot zone of a structure? Number 1, New trees must be planted and maintained so that the tree drip line at maturity is 10 feet from any combustible structure. Number 2, the horizontal distance between the crowns of trees must be greater than 10 feet. Number 3, existing trees must be trimmed to provide a minimum separation of 10 feet away from chimney and stovepipe outlets. What are the requirements if you decide to plant non-fire resistant vegetation? New trees that are non-fire resistant, such as conifers, palms, pepper trees, eucalyptus, are permitted as long as the tree's drip line at maturity is a minimum of 30 feet from any combustible structure. The next section intends to reduce wildfire exposure and risk of fire spreading to buildings. The application requires defensible space. This includes: Number 1, all unincorporated lands designated as state responsibility areas by State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. Number 2, any land designated as a very high fire hazard severity zone by the director or local agencies. The defensible space requirements can be found in the Public Resources Code, in the California Code of Regulations, Title 14, in the California Government Code, and in the California Code of Regulations, Title 19. We will review defensible space from the Public Resources Code in this recording after completing Chapter 49 of the California Fire Code shortly. The next section describes that the safety element of a city or county's general plan must be submitted to the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection where it contains very high fire hazard severity zones or state responsibility areas. Next, let's review the Public Resources Code, or the PRC, Section 4291, Division 4, Chapter 3. The following requirements are applied to any structure in or next to a mountain area, or a forest-covered land, shrub-covered land, grass-covered land, or land covered in flammable material. What are the requirements of defensible space? There must be 100-foot defensible space from every side of a structure or building, but not beyond the property line. Per the Public Resources Code, describe the intensity of fuels management around a structure. Fuel management around a structure varies within the 100-foot perimeter of the structure or the defensible space, as described earlier. More intense fuel reductions must be enacted between 5 feet and 30 feet around the structure. An ember-resistant zone is required within 5 feet of the structure. Steps should be taken to minimize erosion, soil disturbance, spread of flammable non-native grasses and weeds. Next, let's define what fuel means in this context. Fuel is defined as any combustible material, including petroleum-based products, cultivated landscape plants, grasses, weeds, and wildland vegetation. Let's continue describing the requirements of defensible space. Number 1, you must have 100 feet from all sides of a structure. Number 2, you must remove that portion of a tree that extends within 10 feet of the outlet of a chimney or stovepipe. Number 3, you must maintain a tree, shrub, plant, or any other plant that is adjacent to a building free of dead or dying wood. Number 4, you must maintain the roof of a structure free of leaves, needles, and vegetative materials. Number 5, before construction of a structure or a structure that was damaged by a fire prior, an owner must obtain certification from local building officials that the structure complies with current standards. Next, let's consult the California Building Code, Part 2, Chapter 7A, which describes materials and construction methods for exterior wildfire exposure. This chapter applies to building materials and systems used in exterior design and construction of new buildings that are within the wildland urban interface fire areas. The intent is to protect life and property by increasing a building's ability in a fire hazard zone in state responsibility areas or in wildland urban interface fire areas to resist flames and burning embers. This chapter applies to all new buildings in any fire hazard severity zone or to any wildland urban interface area. There are exceptions such as occupancy U and C structures and new accessory buildings. The next section of Chapter 7A of the CBC Part 2 intends to prescribe qualifications and testing by approved agencies and describes how to label materials and fire test results as approved by the State Fire Marshal. Fire retardant treated wood to be tested with ASTM D2898. Fire retardant wood shingles and shakes to be approved and listed by the State Fire Marshal. Further, the use of paints, coatings, stains, or other surface treatments are not an approved method of protection from fire. The State Fire Marshal standards referenced in this chapter are found in the California Referenced Standards Code for acceptable exterior wall, window, horizontal projection, and decking. ASTM, NFPA, and UL also lists their own standards. The next section discusses ignition-resistant construction. Ignition-resistant materials to follow ASTM or UL standards. ASTM E84 or UL 723 with a flame spread index not to exceed 25. What is a flame spread index? A flame spread index measures how quickly and how far flames travel across the surface of a material. For example, a Class A FSI or flame spread index between 0 to 25 is classified as an effective class against severe fire exposure. Class E FSI contributes highly to a fire. The lower the class flame spread index number, the better against fire. What are additional methods of determining ignition-resistant materials? Number 1. Materials classified as non-combustible. Number 2. Fire retardant treated wood. Number 3. Fire retardant treated wood shingles and shakes for use as a Class B roof covering when installed over solid sheathing. The next section discusses roofing assemblies in fire hazard severity zones, which must be Class A rating when tested per ASTM E108 or UL 790. Let's begin with roof coverings installed over a combustible deck. This requires a 72-pound sheet of asphalt rolled roofing or glass felt that is surfaced with mineral granules installed over the roof deck. Bird stops over eaves, if possible, should be installed to prevent debris at eaves. Hip and ridge caps must be mudded to prevent intrusion of fire or embers. Roof valleys where flashing is installed must be greater than a number 26 gauge galvanized sheet. And roof gutters with means to prevent accumulation of leaves and debris in the gutter should be installed. The next section discusses vents and openings to resist building ignition from intrusion of burning embers and flame through ventilation openings. Requirements for vent openings include covered wildfire flame and ember-resistant vents. Off-ridge and ridge vents on sloped roofs should be covered with a non-combustible, corrosion-resistant mesh. The next section discusses exterior covering to safeguard against intrusion of flames from small ember and short-term direct flame contact exposure. Applications include exterior wall coverings, exterior wall assemblies, exterior underside of roof eaves, soffits, underside of exterior porch ceilings, underside floor projections, and exterior underfloor areas. The majority of applications require a non-combustible material, ignition-resistant material, and the exterior portion materials to have a minimum of a 1-hour fire-resistant rated construction. To read more about this section, please consult Chapter 7A for additional requirements. The next section discusses exterior windows, skylights, and door requirements. These include multi-pane glazing with a minimum of 1 tempered pane, or to be constructed of glass block units, or to have fire resistance rating of not less than 20 minutes when tested according to NFPA 257.8 to meet the requirements of the SFM standards 12-7A-2, or to have fire resistance ratings of not less than 20 minutes when tested according to NFPA 257, and to meet the requirements of SFM standard 12-7A-2. Operable skylights should be protected by a non-combustible mesh screen where opening dimensions are less than 1/8 of an inch. Exterior doors, surface, and cladding should be made of non-combustible materials and ignition-resistant materials and constructed of solid core wood. Exterior garage door openings around edges should have a maximum of 1/8 of an inch gap or less to prevent intrusion of embers. The next section discusses methods to protect decking, porches, balconies, and stairs. A minimum 6-inch metal flashing should be applied vertically on the exterior of the wall, installed at all deck-to-wall intersections. Walking surfaces of decks, porches, balconies, and stairs to comply where any surface is within 10 feet of the building. The final section discusses Group U occupancy, accessory buildings, and miscellaneous structures that pose fire exposure. It applies to buildings accessory to any building on the same lot. It also applies to trusses, arbors, patio covers, gazebos, and similar miscellaneous structures that require a permit. Structures and accessory buildings within 3 feet of miscellaneous structures requiring a permit and accessory buildings attached or separated from an applicable building on the same lot by less than 3 feet must be made of non-combustible, ignition-resistant materials. Accessory buildings that are less than or greater than 120 square feet and greater than 3 feet but less than 50 feet from a building on the same lot must also be constructed of non-combustible, ignition-resistant materials. Miscellaneous structures greater than 3 feet but less than 50 feet should also be made of non-combustible, ignition-resistant materials. And finally, the roofs of accessory buildings should be made of non-combustible materials or ignition-resistant materials of a Class A rating in fire hazard zones.